Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a phenomenon that pretty much all of us have experienced, but honestly, very few of us actually understand. We're going to unpack exactly why spending money on ourselves so often feels like this heavy, uncomfortable burden instead of the reward it's really supposed to be. If you have ever felt that sudden pang of deep regret when treating yourself, well, you're definitely going to want to stick around. We're going to decode the hidden psychology behind that guilt, and trust me on this, it actually has very little to do with your bank account. So let's set the scene. Picture this. You're standing in a store, holding something you genuinely need, or hey, maybe it's just something you really want. You look down at the red price tag, and suddenly you are completely frozen. A massive wave of guilt just washes right over you. Now you know you can afford it. The money is literally sitting right there in your account, but your brain immediately kicks off this vicious mental tug-of-war. This loud voice in your head starts telling you that the purchase is a burden, it's an unnecessary luxury, and you just don't deserve it. So why does that happen? Well, it is incredibly easy to fall for the core illusion here. When you put that item back on the shelf, you probably walk out telling yourself, oh, I'm just being frugal, I'm just being really good with my money. But what psychology says is an entirely different story. Science reveals that you are actually reacting to deep-seated survival patterns. We're talking about deeply ingrained mental alarms that were wired into your brain long before you ever earned your first paycheck. You're actually reacting to your past, not your financial present. Which brings us to Section 1, the spending guilt trap, and why taking care of yourself feels wrong. Now, notice how this first concept frames self-care not as a relief, but as a severe stressor. Attachment research points to a psychological trait called guilt for needing. Think about it. If a child is raised in an environment where resources, whether that's money or time or even emotional support, were highly limited, they grow up internalizing a very specific belief. They learn that if they are being taken care of, someone else must be burdened. Fast forward to adulthood, and when you try to spend on yourself, an old psychological alarm triggers, literally screaming that your needs are just too much. I really want you to let this insight sink in for a second because it is absolutely crucial. You aren't actually feeling guilty about the dollars leaving your bank account. You're reacting to a lingering, deeply buried fear that your very existence is an inconvenience to the people around you. It's this profound misdirection by your own mind. It really makes you ask yourself, at what point did your basic needs become an inconvenience? Let's look at Section 2, Childhood Needs and Parentification. This is all about children who grew up way too fast. See, many people who struggle the absolute hardest to spend even a dime on themselves were kids who had to grow up way too fast. Psychologists call this parentification. It happens when a child is, explicitly or implicitly, expected to manage adult problems, adult finances, or adult emotions way before they are developmentally ready for it. In these homes, the only way to keep the peace was for the child to learn to put themselves dead last. They were essentially forced to adopt this hyper-responsible identity just to survive their environment. So what's the result? Because you learned early on that your feelings and your needs had to come last, your adult brain fundamentally rejects self-spending. It simply doesn't see buying a new pair of shoes or enjoying a nice dinner as a treat. It sees it as a direct threat. Spending money feels like a severe violation of that exact responsible identity that successfully kept you safe when you were a kid. Moving on to Section 3, Survival and the Future Self, where we see money as a survival shield. If you're someone who finds it exponentially harder to spend on yourself than to just suffer in silence, you probably possess what psychologists call survival independence. This is a form of extreme hyper-self-reliance. You're basically operating under the core belief that outside support is totally unreliable, and therefore you've got to handle absolutely everything completely alone. To a mind that's wired in this red zone of survival, spending money feels like throwing away your ultimate shield. You don't view a purchase as a reward, you view it as wasting resources you might desperately need later, when no one is there to help you. Just look at the anxiety trajectory playing out in your mind here. It's fascinating. You aren't just protecting yourself today. Psychology shows that some people don't just fear burdening others right now, they're utterly terrified of burdening their future self. You view your current desire for a little bit of comfort as a dangerous drain on the resources that your future self is inevitably going to need when the next crisis hits. And this constant state of self-deprivation is driven by what psychologists call an external locus of control. That's the psychological belief that life just happens to you and that some sudden catastrophic disaster is literally always just around the corner. Because of this, your brain is perpetually prepping for a someday catastrophe that hasn't even happened yet. I mean, you simply cannot enjoy the present when your mind is constantly bracing for an imaginary, disastrous future. Which takes us to section 4, the sufferer's uneasy rest. This is what happens when calm feels like a threat. This brings us to a really interesting phenomenon known as uneasy rest. You know, if things are going too well in your life, or if you actually finally treat yourself to something nice, your nervous system doesn't relax. Nope. Instead, it stays on high alert, just waiting for the proverbial other shoe to drop. You've inadvertently trained your own brain to associate periods of comfort, calm, or personal spending with impending danger. Ironically, you're using frugality as a coping mechanism. Because you were conditioned in your early years to believe that calm usually leads to chaos, staying in that metaphorical red zone of frugality actually feels safe to you. Operating in this manufactured crisis mode of denying yourself acts as a familiar alarm system. Crazy as it sounds, it feels psychologically safer to you than the vulnerability of true comfort. Over time, all of this hardwires into an identity misalignment, creating what we call the sufferer persona. Your brain actively resists any action that doesn't match how you see yourself. If your entire identity is built on being the strong one, the stoic sufferer, the person who can survive on just black coffee and sheer willpower, then spending money on yourself literally causes an identity crisis. It completely violates these deep subconscious rules you've written for your own life. It is so vital to recognize this. You aren't actually trying to save money. You're subconsciously trying to remain the person you've always been, the one who just doesn't ask for much. The really heartbreaking reality of the sufferer persona is that it avoids asking for anything at all, purely to completely avoid the devastating pain of expecting something and then being disappointed. Let's look at our final section, Section 5, redefining your financial worth and letting go of survival mode. Listen, if everything we've covered today feels a little too familiar, I really want you to know this. Psychology does not call you broken. Your guilt over wanting things is not some fundamental flaw in your character. Actually, it simply means your nervous system brilliantly adapted to immense pressure really early in life. You had to learn deep responsibility before you were ever given the gift of safety. You learned how to be incredibly strong before you were ever allowed to be soft. And the ultimate shift we need to make is right here. Moving forward, healing does not mean becoming financially reckless or just blowing all your savings. It means stepping out of that red zone of survival mode and into the yellow zone of healing and growth. It's about slowly teaching your nervous system that you are actually safe now. It means realizing that you are finally, truly allowed to rest. I want to leave you with this final thought. Your needs are not a burden. You're wired for survival, absolutely, but you are meant for more. So the next time you feel guilty about taking care of yourself, ask your brain, am I actually in danger right now, or am I just remembering what danger felt like? If you want to keep decoding the hidden psychology of your life and understanding the deep truths behind why we do the things we do, make sure you subscribe. Because once you understand the mind, you start noticing the things everyone else misses. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.